I'm Estelle Harper, 68 years old, and 7 months ago, I buried my husband Ray. This morning, I stood in his old office with a cream-colored folder in my hands, the one he'd left me before he passed. Today, our children were coming home not to reminisce or share memories, but to hear the words Ray had wanted me to read aloud myself. The same words he'd written by hand, his script wavering but determined. I could already feel the weight of their eyes waiting for answers they thought they deserved. By nightfall, I would discover just how far they were willing to push me and how far I was willing to go to protect him. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever had to stand your ground when family treated you like an obstacle, don't forget to like and subscribe. I grew up in a small Ohio town where everyone knew each other's fathers, mothers, and even their dogs. My parents didn't leave behind much in terms of property or wealth, but they gave me something far more lasting. The belief that what you build with care is worth defending. My father worked the same machine shop floor for 40 years, and my mother kept a garden that fed half the block some summers. When Ray and I married, we carried those values with us, the value of work that left a mark and land that wasn't just dirt, but a place to come back to. Ray and I built our lives on 100 acres that held an old barn, an orchard, and a farmhouse that we mended board by board. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. While our friends vacationed in the city or bought vacation homes, we poured money and sweat into maintaining what we had. It made us proud. Over the years, our children grew up surrounded by the scent of fresh apples and the sound of rain on a tin roof. But somewhere along the way, they seemed to forget what it meant to tend to something for its own sake. By the time Ray fell ill, Brian and Melanie had long since moved into worlds of sleek cars, tight schedules, and business language I barely understood. They spoke of opportunity and leverage instead of roots and legacy. In the weeks before he passed, Ray had been deliberate. He wanted me to read his will to them directly. No attorney in the room, no legalese to hide behind. He said it mattered they saw my face as I spoke his last wishes. I didn't know if they were ready to hear them, but I promised him I would. The day they were due to arrive, I stood in the kitchen, coffee cooling in my hands, the quiet of the house pressing in around me. Melanie would drive up from Connecticut with Greg, who rarely looked up from his phone when he visited. Brian was flying in from Phoenix, always late, always breezing in like the room was waiting for him. In the last week, they had each called, but not to ask how I was holding up. Melanie wanted to discuss repurposing the barn. Brian had emailed about maximizing property value. And now, as the leaves turned gold outside, I knew the meeting ahead would be nothing like the ones Ray imagined. I placed the folder on Ray's desk, the leather of his chair still bearing the shape of his shoulders. The air felt heavier there, as though it understood what was coming. This wasn't just a reading of a will. It was the last bridge between the life we'd built and the future our children seemed eager to redesign. And as I waited for the sound of their cars in the drive, I realized I didn't just feel sadness. I felt something else, rising the quiet knowledge that whatever they had planned, I would be ready. Brian arrived 3 hours later than he'd promised, letting the screen door slam behind him, as if he were coming home from an ordinary errand. There was no apology, just a quick grunt and a glance toward the counter. He smelled faintly of stale cologne and travel, and before he even set his bag down, he asked if the Wi-Fi password had changed. I told him it hadn't. He muttered good and started tapping his phone. Melanie and Greg were already settled at the kitchen table, a silver tablet open between them. They had moved a vase of flowers aside to make room for a stack of folders. Greg barely looked up when Brian took a seat, his focus locked on whatever was on his screen. Melanie slid a set of printed pages toward me as if she were handing over a dinner menu. On top was a bold title, Harper Farm Revival Project. Underneath were photographs of the barn, the orchard, and the upper acres edited to look brighter and more polished than they did in real life. She pointed to a page covered in diagrams. "We've been working on a concept for turning this place into a destination," she said, her voice measured and cheerful. Brian leaned forward, adding that the zoning in the area made it ideal for boutique retreats and upscale events. The two of them spoke in turns, passing the conversation back and forth like a presentation they'd rehearsed. They showed me projections with neat columns of numbers. Melanie highlighted potential revenue streams from converting the barn into an event hall and using the orchard for seasonal festivals. Brian spoke about converting part of the land into luxury tiny homes for weekend rentals. They used words like potential equity and return on investment. I kept my hands folded in my lap, letting the rhythm of their voices fill the space. The more they spoke, the clearer it became that this was not a discussion. It was a pitch, and they were already moving as though I had agreed. When I asked about Ray's will, they exchanged a glance. Melanie smiled thinly and said they hadn't seen the final copy yet, but were certain it reflected what was best for the family. Brian gave a short laugh and said Dad never liked wasting opportunities. He slid another sheet across the table, this one an agreement already filled out with my name at the top. It detailed a transfer of 60% ownership in exchange for shared stewardship. I traced the dotted line with my eyes, but didn't pick up the pen lying beside it. Their voices blended into background noise as they moved on to discussing marketing strategies and timelines. I excused myself, stepping into the next room and closing the door behind me. My hand rested on the frame for a moment, the wood cool against my palm. In that stillness, I recognized something I hadn't wanted to admit. This wasn't about honoring Ray's memory or preserving our home. It was about leverage, about gaining control, while assuming I would quietly hand it over. The following morning, they had rearranged the living room into a tidy semicircle of chairs. A cinnamon-scented candle burned on the mantel. Melanie said it would make the atmosphere warmer. I sat in the center seat, the cream-colored envelope containing Ray's handwritten will resting on my knees. He had signed it 3 days before entering hospice, his script shaky, but his intentions unmistakable. He had wanted everything shared equally, and he had wanted me to be the one to say the words aloud. I began to read, my voice steady at first. Before I reached the second paragraph, Brian cut in to ask whether I'd reviewed the zoning proposal from the day before. I said we would return to that later and continued. A few sentences later, Melanie interrupted to suggest that any decision mentioned in the will should be viewed through a financial lens. I nodded and kept reading. Brian stopped me again to ask if Ray had written it alone or if Lena had helped. I explained that Lena had only assisted with earlier drafts. This one was entirely Ray's. He leaned back and muttered something I didn't catch. Each time I tried to press forward, one of them found another reason to speak. Melanie wanted clarification on the term irrevocable trust. Brian questioned the date of signing. Melanie asked whether the property taxes could be streamlined under a business entity. Brian wanted to know if the document had been notarized. I kept my voice even, answering briefly before returning to the text. I counted each interruption in my head, 1, 2, 3, until the number reached 21. By the time I read the final line, the air in the room felt thinner. Brian was tapping his pen against the chair arm, eyes unfocused. Melanie was scrolling through her phone, the faint glow reflecting off her expressionless face. I folded the will, slid it back into the envelope, and said we would stop there for the day. I told them the lawyer would arrive the next afternoon to review everything. Melanie agreed quickly, as if ending the session were her idea. Brian asked if we could revisit the ownership breakdown later, saying he had a few refinements in mind. I didn't answer. Upstairs, I sat on the edge of the bed. Ray had spent his final days in the envelope beside me. The house was quiet again, but it was not the kind of quiet that follows peace. It was the kind that comes after a storm has passed without rain. They believed they had worn me down, that their persistence had turned the will into a starting point for negotiation. They didn't know I had already decided on my next step. That evening, I went to the hall closet and reached for the small black voice recorder Ray had kept for years. It still bore the scuff mark from the time it had fallen off his desk. I checked the batteries. The display lit up instantly. My fingers remembered the buttons. I slipped it into the pocket of my cardigan, the weight of it resting lightly against my side. Tomorrow, when the lawyer sat with us, I would be ready to capture every word. Not to replay it for them, but to keep a record of exactly how little they valued what Ray had left behind. The morning came cold and bright. I made pancakes, placing the plate on the table out of habit. Melanie took 2 bites before turning back to her email. Brian ate quickly and without comment. No one mentioned the will, and no one asked how I'd slept. At 9:56, a car pulled into the drive, and Dina Morell stepped out, a leather briefcase in her hand. She greeted Brian and Melanie politely, but without warmth, then shook my hand with both of hers. I led her into the dining room, the recorder already tucked under a folded napkin by my seat. Dina began by confirming that Ray's most recent will had been notarized, filed, and deemed legally binding. She explained the meaning of the irrevocable trust in clear, unhurried language. When Brian tried to interrupt, she held her place and finished her sentence. Melanie's questions were brief but pointed, asking whether the trust could be adjusted to increase flexibility. Dina's answer was simple no. The allocations could not be changed without extraordinary legal grounds, and those grounds did not exist. I glanced toward Brian and saw his jaw tighten. Melanie's posture shifted, her arms crossing loosely in front of her. Dina continued, stating that the house would remain solely in my name, the land would be divided equally among the 3 beneficiaries, including Thomas's portion held in trust, until he turned 25, and that Ray had funded a scholarship at the local high school. I felt the familiar catch in my chest when she mentioned the scholarship. I had known about his wish to create it, but not that he had already begun the process. Brian asked whether consolidating the property into a family LLC might be more efficient. Dina repeated that the will was final. Melanie presented a printed list of potential uses for the barn and asked if trust funds could cover preliminary renovations. Dina said it would require agreement from all beneficiaries, including Thomas's guardian and the trustee. The conversation slowed after that. Brian's voice was quieter. Melanie's notes remained untouched on the table. When Dina finished, she closed her briefcase and stood. I walked her to her car. She told me she had handled hundreds of estates, and that what I was doing took resolve. I thanked her and watched her drive away. Inside, the recorder remained under the napkin, still running. I slipped it back into my pocket, certain now that what I had captured would matter later. As the afternoon light moved across the floor, I knew this was only the beginning. After Dina's car disappeared down the gravel drive, I carried the recorder into Ray's office and set it on his desk. The room still smelled faintly of cedar and coffee, a combination that had clung to him for decades. I pressed the playback button and sat back in his old leather chair. Their voices filled the room, calm, polite, even pleasant in tone, yet each interruption carried an edge. The questions, the diversions, the way they shifted the focus away from Ray's words and toward their own plans. I listened to the entire thing without stopping, my hands resting in my lap. My eyes on the window as the late afternoon light began to fade. When the recording clicked off, I labeled the file and saved it to a small flash drive I kept in the desk drawer. Then I sent a copy to my email, making sure there was more than one place it could be found. Ray had always said that preparation was as much about peace of mind as it was about defense. That night, I called Lena to let her know how the reading had gone. She didn't need much detail before offering her support. I told her I might need a witness to how they'd handled themselves. She said to call anytime. The next morning, I reached out to Marcus Keene, the trustee named in the will. His voice was steady, deliberate, the same as I remembered from the years he'd worked with Ray. I explained what had happened, how many times they had broken in while I read, and that I had a recording. He asked me to send it over, so I did while we were still on the line. He said he'd review it that day and begin documenting the behavior as part of the estate's file. Before we hung up, he scheduled a meeting for the following week to go over next steps. By noon, I had also spoken to Maria Collins, Thomas's guardian. She listened quietly while I explained what had been said and how Brian and Melanie had tried to steer the conversation toward altering the estate. When I told her about the recording, she asked me to forward it to her as well. The next day, she called back to say she'd spoken with Marcus and would be filing a formal objection to any restructuring that didn't directly benefit Thomas. Her tone was crisp, but not unkind, the way someone speaks when they've made up their mind. Brian and Melanie didn't notice the calls or the messages I was sending. They assumed I was handling household errands or visiting friends. They filled their hours with phone conversations and laptop screens, occasionally stepping outside to take a call in the yard. One afternoon, I returned from watering the front porch plants to find Brian walking a contractor around the side yard. He was pointing toward the barn and gesturing toward the orchard beyond. When I asked what was going on, he said they were just getting estimates so they'd have the numbers ready when the time came. I told him to cancel. He said I was being difficult. I said the conversation was over. That evening, I noticed a folder left open on the dining table. Inside was a draft budget for a large-scale renovation. The line items included marketing, web design, and something labeled transitional oversight with my name in parentheses beside it. Next to my name were the words, initial soft roll, later phased out. I placed the folder back exactly as I'd found it, then began moving important papers from the office into boxes I could store somewhere safe. It wasn't about leaving. It was about protecting what mattered before someone else could decide for me. 2 days later, I phoned Marcus again to ask about the process for securing certain documents and plans. He confirmed that as long as the will's terms were being respected, I had full discretion over where and how the physical property and records were stored. That same day, I called Maria to tell her about the contractor visit and the budget sheet. She asked me to send photos, so I did. She said she would add them to her own records. In the middle of all this, I went through Ray's old file boxes. Between tax returns and maintenance logs, I found a small folder of sketches he had made, rough drawings of a community garden, notes about possible programs for local veterans, and ideas for mentoring teenagers in the area. On the top sheet, written in pencil, was a single line, "Let them build something that lasts." There was no underlining, no explanation, just those words. I placed the folder on the desk and left it there while I finished sorting. Later that afternoon, Melanie stood at the window while I spoke on the phone in the garden. I could see the curtain move slightly before she stepped back. That evening, I found the barn door open a few inches. Nothing appeared disturbed, but I closed it and locked it again without saying anything. It wasn't worth starting another conversation they'd pretend was harmless. The next morning, Melanie came into the kitchen, already dressed for the day, her phone in hand. She said she and Brian had scheduled a second meeting with the contractor to get more accurate estimates. I told her no one was coming onto the property until the legal matters were settled. She didn't argue, only gave a small nod, and left the room. Around midday, Brian returned from town carrying 2 bottles of wine and a new pressure washer. He said he wanted to start cleaning the porch to keep things in shape. I told him not to touch anything. He smiled without humor and asked if I planned to let the place fall apart. I didn't answer. That evening, an email arrived from a company I didn't recognize, confirming receipt of an application for property valuation. The sender address included Melanie's initials. 15 minutes later, another email came from a local architect about an upcoming call regarding project specs. Both had been sent to a shared thread I had never seen before. I forwarded them to Marcus with a brief note stating no approval or authorization had been given. He replied within the hour saying he would flag the activity and continue documenting. Any planning without full beneficiary agreement, he reminded me, was a direct violation of the trust. That night, I went out to the shed and collected Ray's blueprints, the ones for the orchard, the barn, the garden space. I brought them inside and spread them across the dining table. By the time I finished sorting them into folders, I had the outline of a proposal ready for a local nonprofit I'd been in touch with. Their mission aligned closely with what Ray had envisioned, and the idea of tying the property to something enduring had already sparked interest. I sent them a preliminary outline the following morning. They responded before lunch, saying they wanted to meet in person to discuss it further. When Brian knocked on my door that afternoon, he didn't step inside. He said he needed to talk, but that we could do it later. His voice was tight, measured, as if he were trying to keep something in. I told him I was busy. He nodded and walked away. Watching him from the window, I realized he'd begun to sense that the ground was shifting beneath him, but he didn't yet know in which direction. The morning after Brian's knock on my door, the house felt unusually still. The sun was barely over the trees when I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, watching a thin ribbon of steam curl from the mug. The only sound was the faint tick of the wall clock. I could hear footsteps upstairs, slow, deliberate, and the occasional creak of floorboards. Melanie came down first, fully dressed, phone in hand. Without looking up, she announced that she and Brian had arranged another meeting with the contractor for that afternoon. I told her again that no contractors were setting foot on the property until the estate was settled. She gave a short nod, as though humoring me, and walked out of the room. By midday, Brian returned from town carrying 2 large paper bags. He set them on the counter and pulled out a pair of wine bottles and a boxed pressure washer. "Figured I'd get a head start on cleaning the porch," he said. I told him not to start anything without my say-so. He gave a thin smile and asked if I planned to let the place fall apart. I didn't respond. The air between us tightened for a moment before he carried the box toward the mudroom. That evening, I sat at Ray's desk going through the files I'd set aside. The desk drawer stuck a little at first, just as it always had before sliding open. Inside was the flash drive with the recording tucked beside a stack of utility bills. I moved the drive into a small lockbox and then turned my attention back to the folders. Near the bottom of the pile was the set of sketches Ray had made for the orchard and community projects. I studied the faint pencil lines again, the simple note at the top. "Let them build something that lasts." The words seemed to anchor me to the next step. After dinner, I checked my email and found 2 new messages. The first was from a company I didn't recognize, confirming a request for a property valuation. The sender's address included Melanie's initials. The second came from a local architect referencing an upcoming call about design specifications. Both had been sent to a thread I'd never been part of. I forwarded them to Marcus with a short note making it clear I had not approved or authorized any such requests. His reply came within the hour he would flag the communications, add them to the formal record, and remind all parties that unauthorized planning violated the trust. Later that night, I went out to the shed. The air was cool and carried the faint scent of old wood and engine oil. I found Ray's rolled-up blueprints on a shelf secured with a fraying rubber band. I brought them inside and spread them across the dining table, arranging them beside his sketches and notes. With a notepad at my side, I began outlining a proposal for the nonprofit I'd spoken with the week before. I worked steadily, stopping only to refill my water glass until I had a clear, organized plan. It was nearly midnight when I emailed the outline to their director. The response came quickly the next morning. They were interested, they wrote, and wanted to meet in person to discuss the details. We set a date for later in the week. I kept the exchange to myself, going about my usual routine as Brian and Melanie moved in and out of the house with their phones pressed to their ears. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed Melanie standing at the front window while I took a call from the garden. She stepped back as soon as she saw me glance toward the house. That night, I made a point of checking the barn before locking up. The door was open a few inches. Nothing appeared disturbed, but I closed it firmly and slid the latch into place. The next morning, I walked the length of the orchard, stopping to look over the fence line before heading back inside. In the kitchen, Brian was making coffee, his tone casual as he asked if I had given any more thought to the future of the property. I told him I was focusing on what was in front of me. He didn't press. Later that day, Marcus called to update me. He had documented the emails and confirmed that any further unauthorized action could trigger legal measures. He also mentioned speaking again with Maria, who remained firm in her position that Thomas's interests would be defended against any changes. After the call, I printed every relevant message and placed them in a binder, keeping it within reach. That evening, the house took on an odd sort of calm. The usual shuffle of footsteps and low conversations in the hall had gone quiet. I spent the time going over Ray's notes, reviewing each line and date, cross-referencing them with the sketches and blueprints. Piece by piece, the picture of what he'd intended became clearer, not just maintaining the land, but using it in a way that anchored it to the community. The more I read, the more certain I became about moving forward. The day before my meeting with the nonprofit, I walked through each space that might be part of the proposal: the orchard rows, the barn's main floor, the stretch of open ground near the old compost bins. I took photos and made notes on the light, the soil, and the condition of the structures. By evening, the plan felt less like an idea and more like a commitment. I stored the photos with the rest of the proposal materials and locked them away for the night. When I finally turned off the light in the dining room, the table was still covered in Ray's papers. The edges of the sketches curled slightly, the pencil lines faint in places, but still readable. I paused at the door, looking back at the arrangement. In a few days, if everything went as I hoped, those papers would be the start of something Ray had once imagined, but never had the chance to begin. And with that thought, I felt ready for whatever would come next. The meeting with the nonprofit was set for Thursday afternoon. By the time their car pulled into the driveway, the papers on the dining table were neatly stacked, Ray's sketches resting on top. The two visitors introduced themselves as Clarice Hayes, the program director, and Daniel Reed, a coordinator who specialized in agricultural projects. They shook my hand warmly, their eyes moving over the orchard through the window before we even sat down. Clarice spoke first, saying she'd reviewed the outline I'd sent and believed it could align perfectly with their expansion plans. We spent the first half hour walking the property. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of damp soil. I showed them the barn, pointing out where Ray had reinforced the beams and where light filtered through the slats in the late afternoon. We walked the orchard rows, and I told them which trees were the oldest and which had always needed extra care. Daniel took careful notes, occasionally snapping a photograph. Clarice listened quietly, asking questions about the layout and access points. She seemed to understand that this wasn't just about open space, it was about preserving something with purpose. When we returned to the house, we sat at the kitchen table and spread the plans out between us. Daniel pointed to the area near the compost bins and suggested it could host a small greenhouse for year-round educational programs. Clarice talked about seasonal workshops, youth apprenticeships, and volunteer maintenance days. Their ideas built on Ray's notes without erasing them, and for the first time in weeks, the conversation felt like a collaboration instead of a negotiation. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. Before they left, Clarice said they would take the proposal to their board at the end of the week and expected a quick decision. As I walked them to their car, I noticed Melanie's SUV parked just beyond the bend in the road, far enough to be out of the driveway, but close enough to see who was here. The engine was running. She didn't get out, and I didn't wave. When I turned back toward the house, the car eased away. That evening, I reviewed the notes from the meeting and added a few refinements to the outline. I emailed a copy to Marcus so he would be aware of the progress. His reply was brief but approving. He also reminded me that any transfer of property would require documented compliance with the trust's terms, something he was prepared to handle as soon as the nonprofit board agreed. The next morning, Brian came into the kitchen while I was slicing apples for a pie. He asked if I had any updates on future arrangements. I told him I was still exploring options. He lingered for a moment, then mentioned that he and Melanie had a big picture plan they wanted to present over dinner that weekend. I agreed to hear them out, though I had no intention of being swayed. After he left the room, I wrote the time and date of our conversation in my notebook, adding it to the growing list of records. Over the following days, I went about my routines quietly. I walked the orchard each morning, checked the locks on the barn and shed, and kept the proposal folder close at hand. On Wednesday afternoon, Clarice called to say the board had approved the partnership unanimously. They were ready to move forward pending the necessary paperwork from Marcus. I thanked her and set a meeting for early the next week to finalize details. That night, I received another email from Marcus confirming he had spoken with the nonprofit's legal counsel and that all documents were in order. He planned to prepare the transfer papers immediately. I read his message twice, then closed the laptop and went to the window. The orchard stretched into the dark, the faint outline of the trees barely visible under the thin light of the porch lamp. Ray's words, "Let them build something that lasts," settled quietly in my mind. The day of the dinner arrived with a pale sky and a steady breeze. By mid-afternoon, I could hear Melanie moving through the kitchen, setting the table with cloth napkins and polished silverware. The smell of catered food drifted in from the covered dishes she'd brought in. Brian carried in several bottles of wine and placed them in the center of the table. He greeted me politely, though his eyes were fixed on the folder under his arm. At 6 o'clock sharp, we sat down. Brian stood, glass in hand, and gave a short toast about moving forward together. Melanie smiled and touched his arm, then reached for her folder. She laid it in front of me and began outlining their proposal, converting the orchard into a wedding and event venue, repurposing the barn for retreats, and developing the upper acres for short-term rentals. She spoke in a calm, even tone, her fingers lightly touching the edge of the papers. I waited until she finished before I spoke. I told them that as of that morning, the orchard barn and adjacent lot had been formally transferred to the nonprofit organization I'd been working with. The property would now be used for educational and community programs in line with Ray's original vision. Their shares of the trust remained unchanged, but the land itself was no longer available for commercial development. Melanie's expression tightened. She asked if this was final. I said Marcus had the signed documents, as did the nonprofit's legal team. Brian's voice was sharper when he spoke, saying I was dismantling everything Dad had worked for. I told him this was exactly what Ray had worked for, something that would last beyond profit. The room went quiet. No one reached for the wine, and no one spoke again until Melanie began gathering her papers. They left soon after, their chairs scraping softly against the floor. I stayed at the table for a while, the candles burning low, the dishes cooling in front of me. The next morning, the house was silent. No footsteps in the hallway, no muffled phone calls from the other rooms. On the counter was a short note in Melanie's handwriting. "We need space. Things have shifted too far." There was no signature. I folded it once and placed it in the notebook with the rest of my records. Outside, the orchard stood in the morning light, steady and unchanged, waiting for the next step. Marcus called the morning after Brian and Melanie left. His tone was calm as he told me he had spoken with Melanie's attorney. They had reviewed the property transfer and confirmed it was airtight. The nonprofit partnership was now fully recognized, and the orchard and barn could proceed with their community-focused plans without interference. He said he would be sending me the next quarterly trust report and scheduling a review meeting for the following month. After we hung up, I stood by the kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching the orchard rose. The sunlight filtered through the branches, scattering across the damp ground. The steady quiet in that moment felt like something settling into place. That afternoon, the nonprofit team arrived to go over the pilot program in more detail. We sat at the kitchen table where Brian had once spread business proposals. Clarice laid out a simple schedule: twice-weekly volunteer days, apprenticeship opportunities for local high school students, and seasonal community events. Daniel added that the barn could be used for small workshops during the colder months. I handed them Ray's sketches so they could see his original vision. They studied the pages carefully, asking questions about the layout, access, and existing infrastructure. One of the younger volunteers, a counselor named Devin, joined us toward the end of the meeting. He explained that he would be bringing the first group of students later in the week. His voice carried an easy warmth, the kind that seemed to put people at ease. Before they left, Clarice mentioned that a local artist had offered to create a mural on the barn's exterior. She described the design rolling hills under an open sky with a figure planting a tree. At the base, in small lettering, it would read, "Planted with Purpose." The phrase matched Ray's handwriting almost exactly. On Friday morning, the first volunteer group arrived. A dozen teenagers stepped out of a van, some trying to hide their curiosity behind casual shrugs. They wore mismatched boots and jackets, and a few carried work gloves tucked into their pockets. I led them through the orchard, slowly pointing out the irrigation trench Ray had dug years ago, the compost bins behind the hedge, and the rows that struggled with too much shade. They listened in fits and starts, but they stayed close. By midday, they were stacking tools, pulling weeds, and brushing dust from their sleeves. When one of them asked if this would be a weekly project, I said yes. He gave a small grin before turning back to his work. Late that afternoon, as we were packing up, I noticed Melanie's SUV parked near the bend in the road, just beyond the county line. She didn't get out, and I didn't move toward her. After a few minutes, the car turned and disappeared. The students didn't seem to notice their attention, still unloading the last of the tools. That night, I sat at Ray's desk and wrote him a letter. I hadn't done that since the week after his memorial. I told him about the kids, about the mural, and about the soil feeling looser under my hands, ready for something new to take root. I slipped the letter into the old cigar box he'd kept for decades, alongside ticket stubs, a dried leaf from a trip we'd taken, and a tiny brass key whose lock we'd long since lost. Over the weekend, I began clearing out the rooms we no longer used. I boxed up furniture for donation, sent a stack of books to the library, and kept only what mattered most. The house felt lighter with every piece that left. In the evenings, I would step out to the porch, listening to the wind moving through the trees. The sound was the same as it had been when Ray was here, steady and low, like a voice speaking without words. On Monday, Clarice returned with a small group to begin preparing the barn wall for the mural. The artist, a soft-spoken woman named Linda, introduced herself and sketched the first outlines in chalk. The pale lines were barely visible from a distance, but even in that faint form, the image began to take shape. I brought out coffee for the crew and sat on the porch for a while, watching them work. That afternoon, Marcus called again. He'd received a few lingering inquiries from Melanie's attorney about future involvement in the property, but he assured me those would go nowhere. The trust's terms and the signed transfer left no room for renegotiation. Before ending the call, he said he admired how thoroughly I had documented every step. I told him it was simply the way Ray and I had always handled things. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm. The students came twice a week, the mural slowly gained color, and the orchard began to show the first signs of spring. One morning, a tall boy named Andre approached me during a break. He asked if he could help build new benches along the east row, explaining that his grandfather had been a woodworker. I told him that would be more than welcome. We didn't speak much as we measured and marked the lumber, but the silence felt comfortable, shared between us, rather than empty. By the end of the second week, the mural was nearly complete. The figure planting a tree stood against a backdrop of soft hills and open sky, the words, "Planted with Purpose," anchoring the scene. Linda stepped back with a satisfied nod, and the students clapped quietly. I thanked her, and she said she hoped the image would last as long as the barn itself. That evening, I placed one of Ray's old caps on the bench Andre and I had built right in the center facing west, where the light always fell best. The orchard stretched beyond it, branches just beginning to bud. Standing there, I felt the day's work settle into me like the quiet after a long conversation. In the distance, the wind carried the faint scent of new growth. and I knew the next season was already on its way. The morning after the mural was finished, the orchard felt different. The air was still cool, but the light had softened, filtering through the trees in a way that made the colors in the painting seem brighter. I walked out to the barn with a mug of coffee, pausing in front of the wall. The figure planting a tree seemed almost in motion, now the words, "planted with purpose," standing out against the fresh paint. Andre arrived not long after, carrying a small box of screws and a worn measuring tape. We set to work installing the second bench along the east row, our hands moving in quiet coordination. By midday, the first group of students arrived. Devin greeted me at the gate, his clipboard tucked under his arm. The teenagers split into small groups, some heading for the orchard rows, others toward the compost area. The work went faster now that they knew the routine. I walked between the rows, checking in on each group. The sound of laughter carried on the breeze, light and unforced. It reminded me of the days when Ray would host neighborhood kids for apple picking, showing them how to choose fruit that was ready. Around 3 o'clock, Clarice stopped by with a few more program materials. We sat at the kitchen table while she updated me on the next month's schedule. She mentioned interest from a local gardening club in partnering for a seasonal planting event. Before she left, she glanced toward the orchard and said the place felt alive in a way she hadn't seen before. I didn't respond, but her words stayed with me as I walked her to her car. That evening, I found a small envelope tucked inside my screen door. There was no name on the outside, just a folded sheet of paper inside. The handwriting was Brian's. It was a brief note saying only that he and Melanie were willing to reopen discussions if I reconsidered the transfer. I placed the note in my record binder without replying. Marcus had been clear the matter was settled, and any further contact about it would be documented. The next few days passed without incident. The students continued their work. The benches were finished, and Linda returned once to apply a protective seal over the mural. On Thursday afternoon, I stepped out to check the mail and saw Melanie's SUV again, parked in the same spot as before, near the bend in the road. She stayed longer this time, the engine idling. After several minutes, she drove off without approaching the house. Friday morning brought a steady drizzle. The students worked in the barn, sorting tools and building simple wooden crates for storing harvested fruit later in the season. Devin showed Andre how to sand the edges smooth, their conversation low but steady. I brewed an extra pot of coffee and carried it out for the volunteers, the scent mixing with the damp air inside the barn. Later that day, Marcus called. He had received another inquiry from Melanie's attorney, this time framed as a community engagement request. He told them politely that all community engagement would be coordinated through the nonprofit and that I was under no obligation to respond directly. Before hanging up, he reminded me to forward any letters or notes I received. I assured him I was keeping the records current. That weekend, Clarice organized a small gathering to celebrate the program's first month. Volunteers, students, and a few community members came together under the barn's open doors. A long table held plates of food, and the mural formed a bright backdrop for the group. We shared a simple meal, people talking in clusters while the rain eased outside. When it was time for speeches, Clarice spoke briefly about the orchard's new role in the community and how it reflected its history. As the gathering wound down, I walked the length of the orchard one more time. The ground was soft from the rain, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. From the far edge, I could see the barn and the mural, clearly the benches lined neatly along the east row. The scene felt complete in a way that was quiet rather than triumphant. It was a place in motion, carrying forward without having to be pushed. The next morning, I noticed a plain white envelope in the mailbox. Inside was a single sheet of paper with the words, "Last Chance," written in thick black ink. No signature, no return address. I took a photograph of it and emailed it to Marcus, who replied almost immediately advising me to store the original in my records and not engage. I followed his instructions and then set the envelope aside. In the afternoon, Devin arrived early with 2 students to start clearing a new section of the orchard for planting. As we worked, the sound of a car slowing on the road reached us. I looked up in time to see Melanie's SUV pass by without stopping. The moment was brief, but it carried a weight that stayed with me for the rest of the day. By evening, the orchard was quiet again. I sat on the porch with a blanket over my lap, watching the last light fade behind the mural. The colors deepened in the shadow, but the figure planting the tree remained clear, the small words beneath it almost glowing in the dim light. I stayed until the first chill settled in, then went inside certain that the next step was approaching. The letter from Marcus arrived on a Tuesday morning, folded neatly inside a large envelope. It confirmed what I had hoped for, but hadn't let myself expect the legal process was officially closed. The orchard was secure under the nonprofit's protection, and no further claims could be made. I set the letter on the kitchen table, letting the words settle in before calling Andre to share the news. His voice lifted with quiet relief, and he promised to stop by that afternoon. By midday, the sun had warmed the damp ground from the weekend's rain. I walked the orchard rows, pausing to touch the new buds forming on the youngest trees. The benches gleamed in the light, the mural holding its colors as if it had been part of the barn all along. When Andre arrived, he carried a basket of early apples from his own property, setting them on the porch as a kind of offering. We sat for a while, watching a pair of students finish planting near the east fence, their laughter carrying easily on the breeze. The next week brought small but steady changes. Clarice confirmed the gardening club's planting event, and Devin finalized plans for the next round of student visits. Even Linda returned briefly, adding a thin, weatherproof coat over the mural and smiling as she stepped back to admire it. The orchard had shifted into a rhythm I hadn't felt in years, not rushed, not uncertain, but moving forward on its own strength. One quiet evening, I found myself on the far side of the property, standing where the rows thinned and the view opened toward the hills. The air was cool, the light softening into the first hint of dusk. I thought about all that had been risked and all that had been protected. The orchard wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to the hands that worked it, the people who showed up to keep it alive, and the community that had quietly claimed it as their own. As I walked back toward the house, the mural came into view again. The painted figure still knelt in the soil, the small tree in its hands ready for planting. The words beneath, "planted with purpose," caught the fading light. It felt like more than a statement. It felt like a promise. I know now that standing your ground doesn't always mean fighting loud battles. Sometimes it means tending what's worth keeping until it's strong enough to stand on its own. The orchard taught me that, and maybe in some way, it taught a few others too. If you've ever had to hold on to something you knew was worth protecting, I'd like to hear your story. Share it if you can, and if you found something here worth remembering, stay with us for the next one.